5%. That trajectory is followed by other regions of the world, for example, in North America, Canada, in Asia, South Korea, in Latin America, Chile, and in sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia, which has brought its rate of child mortality down from 25% to 6% just in 4 decades. That is still too high, but the declines are continuing. Women, too, were at risk of losing their lives when they gave birth to children. In 1750, 1% of Swedish women died in childbirth. That has been reduced by a factor of 250. And once again, similar improvements are being replicated in other parts of the world. Here we have the United States, Malaysia, and Ethiopia. Health. The most deadly immediate killer for most of human history was infectious disease, which rarely kills people in the developed world today. It is still a major scourge in the developing world. But even there has been fantastic progress just in the last 20 years, where the rate of childhood deaths from the 5 most lethal infectious diseases have all come down: pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, measles, and HIV/AIDS. Sustenance. Famine was one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and could strike any part of the world without warning. And until the agricultural revolution in England in the second half of the 18th century, around the time of the Enlightenment, no country grew enough calories to feed its entire population. About 2,500 would be a good benchmark. Then in Britain, with the discovery of crop rotation and other advances in agronomy, later with the invention of synthetic fertilizers, mechanization of agriculture, transportation networks, and the selective breeding of vigorous hybrids, England acquired the ability to feed itself. The United States, France as an example, and in the just in the last half century, China and India have developed the ability to feed themselves. Here you have the graph for the world as a whole. Now, these extra calories would be a dubious form of progress if they simply went to making fat people fatter. But in fact, they have gone to reducing the rate of undernourishment. In 1970, 35% of people in the developing world were undernourished. That has been brought down to less than 15%. The advance took place first in Latin America, then Asia, and progress is taking place now in sub-Saharan Africa. And the most severe effects of insufficient calories occur during famines, which throughout history could wreak tremendous devastation on any part of the world. But the world has been conquering famine, which today takes place only in the most remote and war-torn regions. Prosperity. For most of human history, there was little to no economic growth. We can see this in a graph of the gross world product from the year 1 to the present, which shows that literally for more than a millennium, there was virtually no economic growth until the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, with the capture of energy, the development of technology, the spread of education, institutions for finance and markets, and later with global trade. The gross world product has increased by a factor of about 200 since the 18th century. As before, the great escape, as Angus Deaton puts it, from universal squalor and wretchedness was highly uneven across the Earth's surface. European countries like the UK were the first to escape from universal poverty and surpassed by the United States. But more recently, South Korea has lifted itself out of abject poverty into affluence. Chile in Latin America. And still more recently, the 1.3 billion people in China and billion people in India are starting to show exponential growth in GDP. Here's a graph for the world as a whole. Again, this would be a dubious form of progress if it was simply making the 1% still richer. But in fact, the growth of affluence has been decimating extreme poverty. If you define extreme poverty by the bare minimum necessary to feed oneself and one's family, then 200 years ago, 90% of the world's population met the criterion of extreme poverty. That has fallen to 9.6%. Indeed, there's been a 75% reduction in the rate of extreme poverty just in the last 3 decades. As a result, the inequality measured between countries has been declining. It had to increase with the Industrial Revolution as a few countries escaped from universal poverty, leaving the rest behind. But now that poor countries are getting richer faster than rich countries are getting richer, the world has turned a corner and international inequality is declining. Within rich countries, of course, inequality has been notoriously increasing, but that doesn't mean that rich countries have been turning their backs on the poor. Quite the contrary. For most of the history of rich nations, no country devoted more than 1.5% of its GDP to redistribution to the poor, the sick, to children, to the aged. But then in the 20th century, every developed country went on a massive program of social spending, so that today the median among OECD countries is to redistribute 22% of the gross domestic product to social transfers. Thanks in large part to these social transfers, even with rising inequality, poverty has declined. Here we see figures for the United States showing that in 1960, about a third of the population fell below the poverty line when measured in terms of income after taxes and transfers. That has fallen to less than 7%. And when poverty is measured in terms of consumption, what people can afford to buy, it's gone from 30% to 3%. Peace. For most of human history, war was the natural state of relations between countries, and peace was a mere brief interlude between wars. We can see this in a plot of the percentage of years that the world's great powers, the 800-pound gorillas of the day, fought each other in great power wars. 300 years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war. Now they are pretty much never at war. The last great power war pitted the United States against China 65 years ago. If we zoom in on the 20th century, we see that despite a decreasing number of wars, 2 of the wars that did occur were unprecedentedly destructive, namely World War I and World War II. But despite fears that this would be just the harbinger of an even more destructive World War III, fears that many of us grew up with, pitting the United States against the Soviet Union in a nuclear war, the Soviet Union went out of existence, the Cold War ended, and World War III never happened. As you can see in the long peace, the period of more than 70 years in which the rate of death in warfare has been wrinkled carpet. If we zoom in on the post-war period, we see that even within that period, there has been a bumpy but unmistakable decline in the rate of death from all wars put together, including colonial wars and civil wars, from about 22 per 100,000 per year during the Korean War in the early 1950s, to about 9 during the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 70s, to about 5 during the Iran-Iraq War during the 1980s. Today it stands at about 1.2, and this is taking into account the worst war in a generation, the horrific Syrian civil war. But we have to keep in mind that not so long ago, there were many horrific civil wars all taking place at once. Freedom and rights. We have all been made aware of the disturbing backsliding toward autocracy in countries like Russia and Turkey and Venezuela. But nonetheless, the overwhelming historical trend is in the direction of democracy, as we can see in this graph, which plots the relative democracy versus autocracy score for the entire world. 200 years ago, the number of democracies could be counted on the fingers of one hand, and they comprised about 1% of the world's population. Today, 2/3 of the world's countries, comprising about 2/3 of the world's population, lives under democratic governments. And lest this seem incredible, keep in mind that in the 1970s, when I was an undergraduate here at McGill, the world had only 31 democracies. Half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain, living under communist totalitarianism. Even west of the Iron Curtain, Spain and Portugal were fascist dictatorships. Greece was under the control of the colonels, a military junta. Most of Latin America was under the control of military governments. In Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, all of them democracies today. The power of governments to brutalize their citizens is, on the whole, being curtailed. I don't know why we're suddenly getting that feedback. Make sure that's off. In earlier times, virtually every country had the death penalty. Is my microphone still on? You can hear me in the back? Okay. And it was often applied to trivial misdemeanors like poaching and shoplifting, often in grisly torture executions like disemboweling and burning at the stake. But beginning with the Enlightenment and accelerating in the 20th century, country after country has abolished the death penalty. Today there are about 3 countries a year that abolish the death penalty, and if current trends continue, the death penalty will vanish from the face of the earth by the year 2026, joining other barbaric but universal customs like slave auctions and human sacrifice. Just to give you one other example, homosexuality used to be a crime in the majority of the world's nations, but country after country has decriminalized homosexuality. Child labor. In 1850, 30% of English children were sent to work on farms and factories, but with the transition to an economy that valued knowledge and education, with the general rise in affluence, with the mechanization of agriculture, needing less muscle power in the fields, and an increased valuation in the lives of children in general, England, the United States, Italy, and other developed countries have brought the rate of child labor down to close to 0. And the world as a whole is making progress. Just in the last 50 years, the rate of child labor has fallen from about 30% to 10%. 3 years ago, Kailash Satyarthi shared the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, his activism in reducing child labor, and these graphs show that his efforts were a success. Violent crime. In any part of the world that lives in a state of anarchy, there will be high rates of interpersonal violence. For example, in medieval Europe, at the time a feudal patchwork of fiefs and baronies, the homicide rate was about 35 per 100,000 per year. But as kingdoms started to exert control over the medieval patchwork, and the code of vendetta and manly honor was replaced by a court system and the rule of law, the rate of homicide was reduced in Netherlands and England to 1 per 100,000 per year. That is a decline by a factor of 35. And that tends to be replicated whenever a government brings a frontier anarchic region under the control of the rule of law. It happened in colonial New England. It happened in the American Wild West when the sheriffs came to town. And it has even happened in countries that still have high rates of violence today, like Mexico. But a century ago, Mexico had an even higher rate of violence, 5 times higher. If we zoom in on the 20th century, we see that the United States, which underwent something of a reversal in the control of violent crime in the 1960s, but it has reversed the reversal, and the rate of homicide in the US has fallen by more than half. I unfortunately forgot to add back the graph for Canada in this graph. It is far lower than the rate in the United States, but Canada too had an increase in the violent crime rate in the 1960s, which has since been brought under control. And that's a pattern in the world as a whole. The world has brought its homicide rate down by about 30% just in the 21st century. It's not just homicide that's been reduced, but violence against women, such as domestic violence and rape, and violence against children, including violent victimization at school and physical abuse and sexual abuse by caregivers. Indeed, we've been getting safer in just about every way, thanks to improvements in the safety of cars, such as seat belts and airbags and collapsible steering columns, the design of safer highways, better enforcement of traffic laws. Your chance of getting killed in a car accident has come down by 96%. We are 88% less likely to be mowed down on the sidewalk, 99% less likely to die in a plane crash, 59% less likely to fall to our deaths, 90% less likely to drown, 92% less likely to burn to death. Fire departments are now putting themselves out of business. 92% less likely to be asphyxiated, but there is one exception to the trend of increasing safety, and that is the category that safety engineers call death by poison from solid or liquid, and here you're seeing the current opioid epidemic. At the same time, we're 95% less likely to die on the job, and we're even less likely to die in the proverbial acts of God. The droughts, floods, fires, storms, volcanoes, tsunamis, landslides, heat waves, and cold snaps. Presumably not because God is less angry with us, but because of more resilient infrastructure, better early warning systems, and better emergency responses. In fact, what about the quintessential act of God, the literal bolt from the blue? Yes, we are 97% less likely to be killed by a bolt of lightning. Knowledge. The natural state of humankind is illiteracy, and even in early modern Europe, no more than 15% of the population could read or write. But Netherlands and England achieved universal literacy by the 20th century, followed by Germany, Italy, the United States, Chile, and Mexico. Here you have a graph for the world as a whole showing that 80% of the world is now literate, indeed 90% of the world under the age of 25. Not just men, but women. In 1750, only fewer than 6 women could read or write for every 10 men who could in England, but England achieved gender parity in literacy by the 20th century. And indeed, that is almost true for the world as a whole. The world is very close to gender parity in literacy. The most benighted regions, namely Pakistan and Afghanistan, have nonetheless shown tremendous progress. The reason, by the way, that you, I suspect, had not heard of Kailash Satyarthi, the activist for reducing child labor, is that he shared the Nobel Peace Prize with Malala Yousafzai, who probably deserves some of the credit for the rise of female literacy in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And in perhaps the most unbelievable, incredible, belief-defying example of progress of all, we have been getting smarter. This is true. In a well-documented phenomenon known as the Flynn effect, IQ scores have increased in the 20th century by 3 points a decade. Not because the world embarked on a massive eugenics project of selective breeding of the smartest, but rather because of the spread of education and literacy, the increases in health, and the, the trickle down of technical and abstract concepts and visual symbols from domains of expertise such as science and technology into everyday life. Well, has it made our lives any better? Has it improved the quality of our life? And in many ways it has. In 1870, the typical work week in the United States and Europe was greater than 60 hours per week. That has fallen to less than 40 hours, and most workers today have 3 weeks of paid vacation, which would have been inconceivable in the 19th century. At the same time, thanks to the universal penetration of running water and electricity, even to the poorest of households, and to the adoption of labor-saving devices like washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, stoves, and microwaves, the amount of time that we lose to housework, which people specify as their least favorite way of spending their time, has fallen from about 60 hours a week to fewer than 15 hours a week. And when I say we, I really should say women, because gender was, and in large part continues to be, highly gendered. Housework, that is. Thanks to the shorter work week and the smaller amount of our time that we waste in housework, the amount of leisure time has increased by about 8 hours a week just since the 1960s. For women, that started to level off in the 1990s, and this seemed puzzling until I read dived into the tables in the article. And the main reason is that women today spend more time with their children. In fact, a single working woman today spends more time with her children than a married stay-at-home mom did in the 1950s. So forget your stereotypes of father knows best and leave it to Beaver. We also spend less of our paycheck on necessities, from 60% in a century ago to less than a third today. Has it made us any happier? Well, there's a saying that money can't buy happiness, but that is not exactly true. If you plot people's satisfaction with their lives against the GDP per capita of their country on a logarithmic scale, then you see there's a very strong relationship, both across countries, represented by the different dots, and within countries, represented by the arrows impaling each dot. So richer countries have happier people. Within countries, richer people are happier, which suggests that as the world gets richer, its people should get happier. And indeed, the World Values Survey has found that of the 50 countries for which they have data over the last 40 years, 86% of them have gotten happier. Interestingly, the United States is not one of them. Happiness in the United States has pretty much stagnated for 70 years. Has it come at the expense of the environment? And the answer is it surely has. But as countries get richer, their citizens start to place a higher value on the environment, and they develop the affluence to develop devices that control pollution, that gain more efficiency from a given unit of energy. And the environment is starting to rebound. In fact, the world's environmental report card, the Environmental Protection Index, calculated from Yale University, has found that in 178 out of 180 countries, there has been an improvement in environmental quality over the last 3 decades. I'll just show you some data from the United States. Since the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, the American population has increased by 40%. GDP has increased by 150%. Americans drive twice as many miles as they did in 1970, but they emit 60% less air pollution of the 5 major pollutants. In the temporal world, deforestation has halted as forests are no longer cleared for farmland, as farms have become more efficient and grown more food on less land, leaving abandoned farmland to be reclaimed by forests. In the tropical world, the situation is more dire because deforestation continues. But even there, the tropical world has turned a corner, and the peak of tropical deforestation was about 40 years ago, and it has come down since then. Since 1970, the world has shipped twice as much oil by sea, but has had 85% fewer oil spills. And the proportion of the Earth's surface that's protected against exploitation has doubled in the last 28 years, from 6% to 12%, and the amount of, from 8% to 16%, and the amount of the world's marine areas that is protected against exploitation has doubled from 6% to 12%. So I hope to have convinced you that progress is a fact. It is not a matter of seeing the glass as half full. It's a matter of seeing how much water there actually is in the glass. Now, how has the fact of human progress during these decades been reflected in the news? I'm going to show you a graph of the result of an analysis called sentiment mapping, which tallies the proportion of positive emotion words to negative emotion words in the newspapers and broadcasts that have record going back several decades. What it shows is during all of these decades in which we have been living longer, safer, healthier, and more peaceful lives, the New York Times has gotten increasingly morose. It's not just the Times, but a summary of the world's broadcasts have shown that they've been getting glummer and glummer and glummer. So why do people deny progress? One answer comes from cognitive psychology. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman have shown that humans tend to estimate probability via a mental trick called the availability heuristic. Namely, the more easily we can recall examples from memory, the more likely we judge an event to be. Now, if you combine that with the nature of news, keeping in mind that the news is about stuff that happens, it's not about stuff that doesn't happen, You never see a journalist saying, here I am reporting live from a country that's been at peace for 45 years, or a city that has not been attacked by terrorists today. Also, news is about sudden events, not gradual changes. The news could have run the headline, 138,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 25 years. But they never ran that headline because there was never a particular Thursday in October in which it all happened at once. And we all know that the news has a bias toward the negative. This has actually been shown in studies where editors presented with a portfolio of possible news stories or even framing of the same news stories go toward the most negative ones, leading to the satirical headline in The Onion, CNN holds morning meeting to decide what viewers should panic about for the rest of the day. Well, if you combine the nature of news with the availability heuristic, you can see why people would come away with the impression that the world is getting more dangerous and always has been. The human mind is also vulnerable to what psychologists call the negativity bias, that bad is stronger than good. We dread losses more than we look forward to gains. Negative events loom larger in our consciousness than positive ones. Especially recent negative events. With the passage of time, the negative emotional coloring of memories tends to dissipate, making us inherently vulnerable to nostalgia. And explaining the observation of Franklin Pierce Adams that nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory. This also opens up a market for Old Testament prophets, for impresarios of doom, who can remind us of hazards that we may have overlooked. As Morgan Housel put it, pessimists sound like they're trying to help you. Optimists sound like they're trying to sell you something. Finally, there's a competition among elites for status and prestige and the moral high ground. Society is divided into professional guilds with different degrees of responsibility for making the society run. There are academics, there are politicians, there are business people, there's the military, there are religious authorities. And to criticize society, to say that things are getting worse and worse, is a backhanded way of putting down your professional rivals. It's a way for academics to look down on business people, for business people to look down on politicians, for political challengers to look down on incumbents, and so on. As Thomas Hobbes put it in 1651, competition of praise inclineth to a reverence of antiquity, for men contend with the living, not with the dead. Let me end with 3 questions about progress and enlightenment that may have occurred to you. The first is, isn't it good to be pessimistic, to rake the buck, to speak truth to power, to afflict the comfortable? Well, not exactly. It's good to be accurate. Of course, we must be aware of danger and suffering and injustice where they occur, but we should also be aware of how they can be reduced, because there are dangers of indiscriminate pessimism. One of them is fatalism. If everything is failing, if the world is getting worse and worse despite all of our efforts, then why waste time and money on a hopeless cause? Why throw money down a rat hole? Why throw bad money after good? Indeed, if you think that we are doomed, if climate change doesn't do us in, then runaway artificial intelligence will, well, we may as well have a good time while we can. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. It can also lead to radicalism. If you think that every one of society's institutions is in terminal decline, beyond reform, beyond any kind of improvement or redemption, well, that opens up calls to smash the machine, drain the swamp, burn the empire to the ground, out of the expectation that anything that rises out of the ashes is bound to be better than what we have now. And I think history tells us that can lead to some disastrous consequences. Or to empower demagogues who promise, only I can fix it. Is progress inevitable? And the answer is, of course not. Progress does not mean that everything becomes perfect for everyone, everywhere, all the time. That would be magic. And progress is not magic. Progress is using knowledge to solve problems. Problems are inevitable, and solutions create new problems which must be solved in their turn. The world, in addition, can always be blindsided by nasty surprises, and I've shown you 4 examples: the world wars, the 1960s crime boom, AIDS in Africa, and the opioid epidemic. And the world faces severe global challenges, including climate change and the risk of nuclear war. I think given the progress that we have made, the best attitude toward these challenges is that they are unsolved but solvable problems, not apocalypses in waiting. We should deal with climate change by pursuing decarbonization via carbon pricing, which has recently been introduced in Canada, often a pioneer in policy, and by the pursuit of low, zero, and eventually negative carbon technologies. We must pursue denuclearization via international stability, which makes nuclear weapons more trouble than they're worth, and by programs of arms reduction. And just a couple of hints that these are not utopian aspirations, but in some ways have already begun, is the fact that the amount of CO2 that countries have to emit to create a dollar of wealth has followed historically something of an arc. In the UK, for example, with the Industrial Revolution and the burning of massive amounts of coal, there was a huge increase in the amount of CO2 that had to be emitted to produce a dollar of wealth. But then as England switched from coal to oil to gas and more recently to renewables and nuclear, the carbon intensity of the economy has declined. That happened later in the United States. It is starting to happen in China and India, and here's a graph for the world as a whole. Now, this is not nearly enough to forestall possibly dangerous climate change. Those numbers have to be brought down to 0, which will not be easy, but it shows that modern economies are not inexorably tied to flaming carbon. And when it comes to the risk of nuclear war, we have to keep in mind that no nuclear weapon has been used in 73 years since Nagasaki, and that the world has actually reduced its nuclear arsenal by 85% since the Cold War. In fact, 10% of the electricity generated in the United States comes from reprocessed nuclear fuel from decommissioned nuclear weapons. Once again, this is nowhere near what we need to do to eliminate the threat, but it shows that movement in the right direction is possible. More generally, progress is not a mystical force. It depends on embracing the ideals of the Enlightenment, namely applying reason and science to enhance human flourishing. If we continue to pursue those ideals, there is a reasonable expectation that progress could continue, and if we don't, then maybe it won't. Final question. Does the Enlightenment go against human nature? Is humanism just too arid or tepid or flattened to arouse our animal spirits? Is the conquest of disease, famine, poverty, violence, and ignorance boring? Do people need to believe in miracles, a father in the sky, a strong chief to protect the tribe, myths of heroic ancestors? Well, I don't think so. For one thing, secular liberal democracies, like Canada, are the happiest and healthiest places on Earth, probably in the history of our species, and they are the top destination of people who vote with their feet. Also, I dare say that applying knowledge and sympathy to enhance human flourishing is heroic, glorious, perhaps even spiritual. This is a hero story that is not a myth. Myths are fictions, but this one is true. True to the best of our knowledge, which is the only truth we can have. And it's a hero story that belongs not just to one tribe, but to all of humanity. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So can everybody hear me? My name is Susan Pinker. I'm Steve's sister with great happiness and pride that I'm here today to celebrate his tremendous accomplishment of his latest book, which I think is really one of the best he's written. So it's a great pleasure. I'm going to moderate the question and answer period and start off by answering a question, getting a question out of the way that I'm sure you're all wondering, who's older? And the answer is, he is a lot older. And now I will say, in terms of how the questions will work, there are runners with microphones around the room. So when you raise your hand, there's two right up at the top of those two aisles. When you raise your hand, when I recognize you, a runner will come over and bring you the mic so everybody can hear your question. So I think I'm going to start with this young man over here with the white t-shirt.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Sorry, I have a cold. I know in certain professions, especially education and law enforcement, there's a certain pressure to kind of juke the stats and report things more positively than they actually are. What steps did you take to kind of ensure that your stats reflected the reality that was actually going on?
Yes, well, when it comes to crime, there are only two kinds of data that I use. One of them is homicides, just because a dead body doesn't need a whole lot of debate or he said, she said. It's kind of a corpse. A corpse is a corpse. And so criminologists consider homicide data to be the most reliable indicators of violent crime. Again, not perfect, because there can be debates over whether it was self-defense or, and there are some ambiguous cases. But still, it's harder to argue away and less subject to reporting bias, especially since when it comes to medieval Europe, where I plotted a number of data for the homicide rates, there was an intense interest by the government in tallying homicides accurately, because the government would confiscate the assets of the perpetrator. So it was a good revenue source. In fact, there was a special agent of the Crown who would every year go around to cities, to towns and villages, to tally the number of homicides. And we call that agent of the Crown a coroner, which is why that word persists. In terms of education, it is indeed, that is inherently squishier. What do you count as literacy? And so there are organizations that do their best to try to apply a constant yardstick across time and times and places. But it is inherently, there's going to be more variability and subjectivity. But I use the data that seem from organizations that at least recognize that problem and try to apply a constant yardstick, rather than just, say, relying on the boasts of the educational jurisdictions themselves. Yeah.
And we have a question right here.
Thank you. Yeah, you can hear me. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I agree with everything you said, except when you put markets and finance into progress. I think that when you have 8 men controlling the half the wealth of the world, and when you have corporations not paying their fair share of taxes and hiding their money in tax havens, I wouldn't exactly call that progress. And I could go on, but you know what I mean.
Well, let me ask you a question. Would you rather live in South Korea or North Korea? Would you rather live in East Germany or West Germany?
It's no excuse, you know. It's no excuse for cupidity and greed are no excuse. I don't think we should be putting markets in the realm of progress.
No, it absolutely is relevant, and it's not making excuses. It's identifying what is the source of human prosperity and ultimately human well-being. Now, of course, there are greedy people, and the identifying markets as the best generator of wealth doesn't mean that markets shouldn't be regulated. It doesn't mean that people who engage in trading will all be angels. Regulation is necessary in markets for the same reason that laws are necessary in a free society. It's like saying that we should not have a free society because people commit murder. Yeah, people commit murder, and rape, and assault, and robbery. There are pernicious crimes and habits, and that is true of markets as well. At the same time, it is markets compared to alternatives like top-down control of economy by governments, like royal charters and monopolies, like mercantilist systems, which we know are recipes for poverty and for greed, that in identifying what makes people better off, regulated markets are, I argue, are absolutely the answer. And just to give one more example, China under Mao versus China since the death of Mao. These are all cases in which markets deserve credit for the growth of prosperity, but markets don't mean that people are angels. It doesn't mean that markets should be unregulated.
We have a question over here.
Hello. First, I'm a big fan. Thank you for doing this. I have a two-part question. First part is kind of a linguistic thing. Second part, I'd like to know your opinion on another great study of history by Mr. Harari, Homo Deus, and the usage of the word humanism. The last word of your last slide is humanity. And Mr. Harari wrote a great book called Homo Deus. I'm sure you read it. And it kind of changed, was the tipping point for the usage of the word humanism, because it did not include animals. And animals are still considered as private property. Humanism is considered, according to him, as a religion, the last, maybe, most popular religion. I'd like to know your opinion on it. And is the word humanism still can be used with the same value as something empathetic? Or has it changed? And why have you chosen to use it as part of your title?
Yeah, well, it is true that the word humanism can be a bit misleading in that it would seem to privilege humans, but it really actually, and I could have and should have explained that it actually refers to any sentient creatures. So humanism, both by the way that it's used by humanists and by the actual beliefs and practice of people who call themselves humanists, would include the interests of animals and other sentient creatures. So it is not, in a sense, it's a bit misleading. We don't have a word of sentientism or consciousism to embrace the interests of animals, but it absolutely does. And all the humanist associations, the International Humanist Union, British, American, Canadian, all endorse animal rights and animal interests as well. And Harari has actually been criticized by people in the humanist movement for using a rather idiosyncratic definition of humanism as excluding animals, which is not, in fact, how the word is used.
A question right here.
Professor Pinker, you have managed, in a forceful way to convince us to reduce our pessimism somehow. However, I'm just thinking of a concept that emerged with the emergence of technology. We often talk of the digital divide. And I see that you were referring to some countries, specifically African countries, which apparently, according to you, have also progressed. There is progress there. Don't you see room there for, perhaps what I would suggest as a new concept, the progress divide? Now that the countries in the West have benefited more from this progress, and whatever progress happens to be lived in the South seems to be progress only insofar as those countries are markets, consumers of whatever is produced from the West, of the progress that's happening elsewhere.
No, virtually all, in fact, all of the measures of progress that I have identified apply to sub-Saharan Africa. The one partial exception is that if you plot GDP per capita in African countries, it's very hard to, the rise is unimpressive, but which is one of the reasons that I didn't show it on the graph, that it would just be submerged in the some of the other lines. But as I point out in the book, and what development economists have discovered, is that whereas in general prosperity correlates with other good things in life, with education, with health, with reductions in child mortality and maternal mortality. But now they're starting to be dissociated. So even though the GDP per capita in sub-Saharan Africa does not show a dramatic increase, life expectancy, child mortality, maternal mortality, illiteracy have shown dramatic decreases because they've been partly decoupled from GDP per capita. So that's the only real exception, because all of the trends actually do apply to the developing world, more so to India and Bangladesh and China and Southeast Asia and Latin America so far than to sub-Saharan Africa. But sub-Saharan Africa, in addition, is showing tremendous progress. The problem isn't that they're consumers. The traditional problem with economies in the developing world is that they are suppliers of raw materials. They're the opposite of consumers. We do the consumption using the rubber and the oil and the metals that come from the developing world. But that is starting to change with, for example, the spread of smartphones, where a majority of the world's population now has a smartphone. And of course, this is very obvious when you visit sub-Saharan Africa, where it just seems, even from the eyes of a tourist, that everyone has a smartphone. And in fact, they've even leapfrogged the West in certain technologies, such as mobile banking. But the digital divide is a bit misleading. If anything, it's in digital technology that the divide is being eliminated most rapidly. And more generally, it's in knowledge. The reason for the dissociation that I mentioned between GDP and human well-being is that because so much of well-being now depends on knowledge and information, best practices in health, in farming, and so on, that sub-Saharan Africa is enjoying many of these benefits, even though their economies have not shown the blast-off that the rest of the world has.
Way up at the top.
Can you hear me? Hello. I'm so glad you're in town. I've been wanting to ask you this for so long now. So I run an organization, and one of the things we do is host think tanks with association leaders. And we're finding that there's a really strong negativity around what the future is going to look like. You know, a lot of them are wondering, will our associations be around? A lot of them are even wondering if the industries will be around, because technology is making some big changes there. So the problem is, the whole point of the think tanks is to problem solve. And so this negativity is really impeding those discussions. So your point about fatalism, do you have any advice in terms of kind of trying to push the discourse to a more positive place?
Yeah, part of it is just to show people data that they probably are not aware of. Data, for that matter, that surprised me and that inspired me to write this book is that I was actually stunned to see the graphs for global poverty, for literacy, and so on. Now, I'm a data nerd, and I can't guarantee that this is the most persuasive rhetorical technique. But for some people, perhaps in the think tank world, it can be part of the story. I think a better storyteller than I am would supplement it with more journalistic, literary narrative accounts of how this actually does affect the lives of people. To put things into historical context and point out that what seemed like existential threats of years ago had been domesticated thanks to ingenuity, activism, commitment. Things like the ban on landmines and on biological warfare, the repair of the ozone hole, thanks to the Montreal Accords, among other things, that there have been, that what seem like intractable existential threats in a given era have often been solved. That doesn't guarantee that the ones in the future will be solved, but I think it is at least one way to push back against what I agree is a kind of corrosive fatalism that the culture of pessimism is engendering.
Right here in the front. Did you have a question pointing to you? Did you have your hand up? Okay.
So, in terms of ideas, Enlightenment hasn't had much progress in the last 250 years. So, why did it end? And what can we do to build on it and adapt it to oncoming eras so that we don't accidentally create the next religion?
Yes. Well, it is Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was quickly met with a counter-enlightenment in Europe in the 19th century, with a backlash from religion, from nationalism, from romanticism, from militarism. And they have been kind of pushing against each other for since the Enlightenment unfolded, including most recently with the rise of authoritarian populism today in the United States, in Russia, in Eastern Europe. So it is an ongoing and I would say a severe challenge. Part of it has to be to combine a concern for the people whose lives have been adversely affected by globalization, by automation, with a positive narrative of an overall advancement. And it takes a certain kind of political gift, which I certainly don't have, but which some successful politicians do have. Barack Obama was elected twice and he combined what people perceived as a concern for the badly off with a narrative of hope. In fact, I used as an epigraph to my section on progress a quote that he gave that if you had to choose a time to be born, you didn't know where you'd be born or who you'd be, you'd pick now, which I think is exactly right. I believe that our own Prime Minister campaigned under a slogan that better is always possible, which is another, and clearly he has some political gifts in combining the concern with the hope for progress. I think we also need, beyond the political, I think in the educational realm, we need a reminder of not just how bad things are now, but how bad they used to be, and how some of the solutions of the past have given us gifts that we are liable to take for granted, such as liberal democracy, the rule of law, a court system, literacy and education, by pointing out what life used to be like in the era of hanging judges and lynch mobs and public torture executions and religious persecution, and in parts of the world today that have backslid from those ideals. That should be part of the education of every person. And journalistic culture should have something of a historical consciousness, that an editor should not allow a columnist to use a bad event that happened today and conclude that it's a trend. I mean, that just should not be, we should all be statistically numerate enough to avoid that kind of fallacy, and that should begin with the education system and be kind of common knowledge among academics and intellectuals in general. So those are a number of moves in that direction that I would advocate.
Do we have any more questions, or is that it? One more, perhaps? Just one more? There was this gentleman who's been waiting right there. Yes, you. Yeah.
You mentioned your research, and I'd like to know if you have any books recommendations of what you have been reading that you would recommend.
What I've been reading?
Yeah.
That I recommend?
To inspire you, or use to inspire your research.
Oh, you mean research for this book in particular? Well, in terms of an overall philosophical framework, kind of arc of human progress and development, David Deutsch's The Beginning of Infinity was probably the most ambitious overall framework for why progress should be possible and has occurred. There are a number of books that I also used and recommended in a previous book on the progress in reducing violence. I guess of the most recent ones, I would recommend The Internationalists by Scott Shapiro and Una Hathaway on trying to solve the puzzle of why interstate war has declined since 1945. There are a number of books on the crime decline, including one called The Great American Crime Decline. It doesn't apply only to the United States, but to Western countries in general. There are, wouldn't even know where to begin. I think also, since I'm here, I'll also recommend for the effects of electronic media on well-being and loneliness and health and happiness, I would recommend The Village Effect by Susan Pinker.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming, everyone. Thank you, Steve, for that little shout-out. And thank you, Elsbeth, for the generous introduction for us both and for making this happen today.
Thank you very much. Let me say thank you very much, Professor Pinker, for moderating. Thank you, Professor Pinker, for coming and speaking to us today.
Thank you, Elspeth.
It's an exhilarating talk.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's been an exhilarating talk. It's an exhilarating book. So get the book and come down and have Professor Pinker sign it. We'll be doing a signing right here for the next half hour, okay? So come on down and thank you for coming out. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.